My name is Amanda Foster. I'm 29 years old, and 3 years after inheriting an $8 million estate from my beloved grandfather that included valuable commercial real estate, diversified investment portfolios, and thriving business holdings that I had been carefully managing and growing through strategic financial planning, my parents Robert and Linda Foster used forged legal documents to fraudulently transfer my entire inheritance to my brother Marcus, then physically threw me out of my own home. While screaming that I had no right to anything purchased with Marcus's rightful money. Also, what they didn't know was that their obvious resentment and increasingly desperate attempts to access my inheritance over the past year had prompted me to take comprehensive protective measures that would turn their betrayal into the most spectacular financial and legal catastrophe they could ever imagine, leaving Marcus with millions in hidden debts, while my real wealth remained completely secure in offshore jurisdictions they could never reach or manipulate. The inheritance that changed my life forever came from my paternal grandfather, William Foster, a brilliant businessman who had built a commercial real estate empire over 4 decades through strategic property acquisitions, innovative development projects, and the kind of long-term investment vision that had transformed his initial $50,000 stake into an $8 million portfolio of prime commercial properties, blue-chip stocks, municipal bonds, and business partnerships that generated substantial, passive income while continuing to appreciate in value. Grandfather William had been not just a successful businessman, but also a devoted family patriarch who had taken special interest in my education, career development, and financial literacy, from the time I was a teenager, showing curiosity about his business operations and investment strategies. Amanda has the mind for business and the character for wealth management, Grandfather William had often said during family gatherings where he discussed his estate planning decisions. She understands that money is a tool for creating opportunities and security, not just for personal consumption and luxury lifestyle expenses. The relationship I had developed with my grandfather over the years was built on genuine intellectual connection and shared values about financial responsibility, strategic planning, and the importance of using wealth to create positive impact, rather than just funding personal indulgences and status symbols. During my college years studying business and economics, I had spent summers working in his real estate office, learning property management, tenant relations, investment analysis, and the complex financial planning that was required to maintain and grow substantial wealth over multiple generations. Your grandfather sees something special in you, my grandmother had told me during one of our conversations about family dynamics and William's obvious favoritism toward my business interests and financial aptitude. He believes you have the wisdom and discipline to manage wealth responsibly, rather than squandering it on immediate gratification like so many young people do when they inherit money. The estate planning decisions that William made reflected his assessment of his family members' characters, financial capabilities, and likelihood of preserving rather than dissipating the wealth he had spent decades building. While he loved all his grandchildren, he had observed significant differences in our approaches to money, work, responsibility, and long-term planning that influenced his decisions about inheritance distribution and wealth transfer strategies. My brother Marcus, who was 32 years old and had struggled with employment stability, impulsive spending, and what could generously be described as an entitlement mentality about family wealth, had never shown the same interest in learning about business operations or developing the skills necessary for wealth management and preservation. Marcus had dropped out of 2 different colleges, failed at several startup ventures that had been funded by family loans he never repaid, and had a history of expensive lifestyle choices that far exceeded his modest and inconsistent income from various short-term employment situations. Marcus has good intentions but poor execution. Grandfather William had observed diplomatically during family discussions about the younger generation's career development and financial responsibility. He needs to develop better judgment about money and work before he can be trusted with significant financial resources. The inheritance structure that William ultimately created was comprehensive and legally sophisticated, designed to ensure that his wealth would be preserved and grown rather than quickly consumed through poor financial decisions or lifestyle inflation. The estate included $3.2 million in commercial real estate properties throughout downtown Seattle and surrounding suburbs, $2.8 million in diversified investment portfolios managed by professional financial advisors, $1. $4 million in municipal bonds and corporate debt instruments that provided steady income, and $600,000 in business partnership interests and other alternative investments that required active management and strategic oversight. This inheritance comes with serious responsibilities, William had explained to me during our final conversation about his estate plans. You'll be managing assets that could provide financial security for multiple generations if handled properly, or could be completely lost within a few years if mismanaged or liquidated for short-term consumption. The legal documentation for the inheritance was explicit and comprehensive, naming me as the sole beneficiary of William's estate with full authority over all assets, investment decisions, and wealth management strategies. The will included specific language about his reasons for this decision, citing my demonstrated financial competence, business education, hands-on experience with his properties and investments, and what he described as the maturity and long-term thinking necessary for responsible wealth stewardship. But the inheritance distribution that gave me complete control over William's $8 million estate, while providing only modest bequests to other family members, created immediate and lasting resentment from my parents, Robert and Linda Foster, who had apparently expected to inherit substantial portions of William's wealth, and were shocked to discover that their own financial futures had not been secured through his estate planning decisions. It's not fair that Amanda gets everything while the rest of the family receives almost nothing, my mother Linda had complained repeatedly during family gatherings following William's funeral. Your grandfather made a mistake by putting so much wealth in the hands of someone so young and inexperienced, and we need to find ways to correct this imbalance before Amanda makes poor decisions that waste the entire inheritance. The characterization of my inheritance as a mistake that needed to be corrected revealed my parents' fundamental belief that they were entitled to William's wealth and that his decision to leave everything to me represented poor judgment rather than careful assessment of family members' capabilities and characters. Linda seemed particularly bitter about being excluded from significant inheritance, apparently having expected that her status as William's daughter-in-law would translate into substantial financial benefits that would improve her own retirement security and lifestyle options. My father Robert's reaction was equally resentful, though he expressed his disappointment in terms of concern about family fairness and worry about my ability to handle such substantial financial responsibilities at a relatively young age. Amanda doesn't understand how to manage this kind of money, Robert would say during family discussions about the inheritance. She's going to make mistakes that could cost the family millions of dollars, and we need to be involved in major financial decisions to protect everyone's interests. But beneath Robert's expressions of concern about my financial competence was obvious frustration about his own exclusion from his father's wealth and his belief that traditional family hierarchy should have given him authority over inheritance decisions and asset management strategies. As William's son, Robert had apparently expected to inherit the bulk of his father's estate, or at least to have significant input into how the wealth was managed and distributed among family members. The resentment that my parents felt about the inheritance distribution intensified over the first year, as they watched me successfully manage William's properties, make profitable investment decisions, and grow the estate's value through careful asset management and strategic reinvestment of income, rather than liquidating assets for personal consumption or lifestyle enhancement. Amanda is doing well with the investments, but she doesn't understand family obligations, Linda would say, whenever relatives asked about how I was handling the inheritance. She should be using some of that money to help family members who have financial needs, instead of just hoarding everything for herself like some kind of miser. The suggestion that I was hoarding the inheritance rather than using it to benefit other family members revealed Linda's expectation that inheriting William's money should have made me responsible for solving everyone else's financial problems and funding their lifestyle improvements, regardless of William's explicit intentions about how his wealth should be managed and preserved. But the most concerning development was the increasingly direct pressure my parents began applying for access to the inheritance, including suggestions that I should transfer portions of the estate to Marcus to correct the unfair distribution, and proposals that they should be given authority over major investment decisions to ensure family interests are protected. Have you ever inherited something valuable only to discover that your family viewed your good fortune as their entitlement and would go to extraordinary lengths to steal what didn't belong to them? That's exactly what I began experiencing as my parents' resentment about William's estate planning decisions evolved into active schemes to gain control over my inheritance through manipulation, legal pressure, and ultimately criminal fraud. The first 18 months of managing my grandfather's estate were professionally and personally rewarding, as I successfully implemented investment strategies that increased the portfolio's value by over $400,000 while maintaining steady income streams from rental properties and dividend payments that provided financial security without requiring me to liquidate any of William's carefully selected assets. Working with professional financial advisors and estate management specialists, I had developed comprehensive plans for long-term wealth preservation, tax optimization, and strategic growth that honored my grandfather's vision while adapting to current market conditions and investment opportunities. The commercial real estate properties that formed the foundation of William's wealth were performing exceptionally well under my management, with occupancy rates above 95% and rental income that exceeded projections due to strategic tenant improvements, competitive lease negotiations, and proactive property maintenance that maintained high-quality spaces that commanded premium rents in Seattle's competitive commercial market. I had also identified opportunities for additional property acquisitions that would complement the existing portfolio, while diversifying geographic and sector exposure to reduce risk and increase long-term appreciation potential. Your grandfather would be incredibly proud of how you're managing his legacy, the estate attorney Michael Harrison told me during one of our quarterly reviews of asset performance and legal compliance. You've not only preserved his wealth, but actually grown it significantly while maintaining the conservative long-term approach that he valued. This kind of responsible stewardship is exactly what he hoped to see when he designed his estate plan. The investment portfolio management was equally successful, with strategic reallocations and careful reinvestment of dividends producing returns that consistently outperformed market benchmarks, while maintaining the risk profile that William had established through his original asset selection and diversification strategies. Working with William's longtime financial advisor, Patricia Chen, I had learned to balance growth opportunities with wealth preservation, ensuring that the inheritance would continue providing financial security while building value for future generations. But while I was successfully fulfilling my responsibilities as the estate's beneficiary and steward, my parents were becoming increasingly aggressive in their demands for access to what they continued to characterize as family money that should be managed collectively rather than controlled by one person, regardless of William's explicit legal documentation and estate planning intentions. Amanda needs to understand that this inheritance affects the entire family, Robert had said during a particularly tense family dinner. And major decisions about investments and spending should involve input from people who have more life experience and better judgment about financial planning. The suggestion that I lacked life experience and better judgment, despite my demonstrated success in growing the estate's value, was clearly intended to undermine my confidence and establish justification for family oversight of my inheritance management decisions. But Robert's real concern wasn't my competence. It was his exclusion from wealth that he believed should have been distributed more broadly among family members. Linda's approach was more direct and emotionally manipulative, focusing on what she characterized as my selfishness in not using the inheritance to help family members who had financial needs or deserved assistance with major expenses like home improvements, vacation travel, or Marcus's continued business ventures and lifestyle support. "Your brother could really use some financial help right now," Linda would say during our conversations. "And it seems selfish to have all that money sitting in investments when Marcus is struggling to get his life established and could benefit from a loan or gift to help him start fresh." The pressure to provide financial assistance to Marcus was particularly intense, with my parents regularly citing his various projects, business ideas, and personal expenses as worthy causes that deserved funding from the family money, regardless of Marcus's history of poor financial decisions and failure to repay previous loans from relatives who had tried to help him achieve stability. But my refusal to liquidate portions of William's carefully constructed portfolio to fund Marcus's current schemes or lifestyle choices was met with increasing hostility and accusations that I was being greedy, selfish, and disrespectful of family relationships that should take precedence over rigid adherence to legal documents and estate planning structures. "You're letting money change you," Linda accused me during one of our arguments about family financial support. "Your grandfather never intended for his money to divide the family or make you feel superior to people who weren't as lucky with inheritance. Family should take care of family, regardless of what legal documents say." The characterization of my inheritance as luck, rather than the result of William's careful assessment of family members' characters and capabilities, was particularly frustrating, as it dismissed both my relationship with my grandfather and my demonstrated competence in managing his legacy according to his wishes and intentions. But beyond the emotional manipulation and family pressure, I was beginning to notice more concerning signs that my parents were actively researching ways to challenge or circumvent William's estate planning, including consultations with attorneys about potential legal challenges to the will's validity and investigations into financial institutions and asset management structures that might provide opportunities for gaining access to my inheritance. I heard Mom and Dad talking to some lawyer about whether they could contest grandfather's will, my cousin Jennifer confided to me during a family gathering. They seemed really interested in finding ways to prove that the inheritance distribution was unfair or that you're not managing the money properly. The revelation that my parents were actively pursuing legal strategies to challenge my inheritance was alarming, but not entirely surprising, given their escalating resentment and increasingly desperate demands for access to wealth that they continued to view as rightfully belonging to the broader family, rather than respecting William's explicit wishes about how his assets should be managed and preserved. But Jennifer's warning also provided crucial information that allowed me to begin taking protective measures that would ultimately save my inheritance from the sophisticated fraud scheme that my parents were apparently planning to implement once they determined that legal challenges to William's will would be unsuccessful due to the comprehensive documentation and legal safeguards that had been built into his estate planning structure. The protective measures I began implementing were comprehensive and forward-thinking, designed to safeguard my inheritance from family members who clearly viewed my wealth as their entitlement and were willing to pursue legal manipulation or potentially illegal strategies to gain access to assets that didn't belong to them. Working with international wealth management specialists and offshore legal experts, I began the complex process of restructuring my inheritance through sophisticated trust arrangements and legal entities that would preserve William's wealth, while making it virtually impossible for family members to access or manipulate through domestic legal challenges, forged documents, or other fraudulent schemes that relied on standard inheritance and estate management structures. The offshore restructuring process took several months to complete and involved establishing multiple layers of legal protection, including international trusts domiciled in jurisdictions with strong asset protection laws, corporate entities that provided additional legal barriers between my personal ownership and the underlying assets, and banking relationships in countries that offered privacy protections and legal frameworks that would prevent unauthorized access even by family members who might attempt to use forged documents or fraudulent legal claims. "What you're creating is essentially bulletproof protection for your inheritance," explained international attorney David Martinez during our final restructuring consultation. "Even if someone manages to forge documents or manipulate domestic legal processes, They won't be able to access the real assets because they'll be held through foreign entities and protected by international legal structures that operate independently of U.S. jurisdiction. But the most crucial aspect of my protection strategy was maintaining the appearance of normal asset management, while quietly moving the real wealth beyond my family's reach, leaving behind decoy accounts and properties that would appear valuable, but would actually contain minimal assets and substantial hidden debts that would create financial liability, rather than benefit for anyone who gained unauthorized access. The properties and accounts that remain visible in domestic databases will look like your full inheritance, David explained. But they'll actually be shells that contain hidden mortgages, tax obligations, and other debts that make them financial liabilities rather than assets. Anyone who steals these apparent assets will inherit the associated debts and legal obligations. The decoy strategy was both legally sound and poetically appropriate, ensuring that if my family succeeded in stealing what they believed was my inheritance, they would actually be taking responsibility for millions of dollars in hidden debts and legal obligations while my real wealth remained safely protected in international jurisdictions where they could never reach or manipulate it. The final step in my protection strategy was ensuring that I maintained access to liquid funds and income streams that would allow me to live comfortably and rebuild my life if my family's theft attempts were successful, while also preserving the ability to eventually reclaim the domestic properties and accounts once the fraud was exposed and prosecuted through appropriate legal channels. But while I was quietly implementing these sophisticated protection measures, my parents were becoming increasingly bold and desperate in their attempts to gain access to my inheritance, including direct demands that I transfer portions of the estate to Marcus and threats that they would take necessary action to protect family interests if I continued to refuse their demands for wealth redistribution. This situation with Amanda and the inheritance has gone on long enough, Robert announced during a family meeting that I was not invited to attend but learned about through relatives who were concerned about the increasingly hostile family dynamics. We need to take steps to ensure that grandfather's money is managed in the family's best interests, rather than allowing one person to control everything. The reference to taking steps to manage the family's best interests was ominous and suggested that my parents were moving beyond legal challenges and emotional manipulation toward more direct action that would attempt to physically or fraudulently gain control over my inheritance regardless of legal documentation or my rights as the legitimate beneficiary. But their escalating aggression was also providing confirmation that my protective measures had been necessary and appropriate, and that my instincts about their intentions had been accurate despite their attempts to frame their demands in terms of family concern and financial responsibility, rather than acknowledging their obvious greed and entitlement about wealth that didn't belong to them. The confrontation that would expose my family's true character and criminal intentions occurred on a Tuesday morning in March when I returned to my home, a beautiful colonial house that I had purchased with inheritance funds and had been living in for over 2 years, to discover moving trucks in the driveway and strangers loading my personal belongings into boxes while my parents supervised the operation as if they had legal authority to dispose of my possessions and evict me from my own property. "What's happening here?" I asked Robert as I approached the moving truck, trying to understand why my belongings were being packed by people I had never seen before, and why my parents were treating my home as if it belonged to them, rather than acknowledging that I owned the property and had exclusive rights to determine who could enter or remove items. Robert's response was immediate and shocking in its hostility and legal presumption. "Marcus owns this house now," he announced without any attempt to explain the legal basis for his claim. "And everything in it that was purchased with estate money belongs to him, not to you. We're packing your personal items so you can find somewhere else to live." The casual announcement that Marcus somehow owned my house and that my possessions were being confiscated was so legally absurd and factually incorrect that I initially assumed there had been some kind of misunderstanding or confusion about property ownership that could be quickly resolved through reference to appropriate documentation. "Robert, this is my house," I said, pulling out my phone to call my attorney. "I purchased it with my inheritance money, and it's deeded in my name." You have no authority to remove my belongings or evict me from property that I legally own. But Robert was prepared for my objections and produced a folder of documents that he claimed proved Marcus's ownership of my house and legal authority over all assets that had been purchased with inheritance funds, though the documents appeared to be photocopies rather than original legal papers with proper notarization and authentication. These documents show that the estate transfer has been completed, Robert said, waving the papers in front of me. Amanda was never the legitimate heir, and we've corrected the legal problems with your grandfather's original will. Everything now belongs to Marcus, as it should have from the beginning. The claim that there had been legal problems with William's will was completely false, as the estate had been probated successfully, and I had been managing the inheritance for 3 years without any legal challenges or complications. But Robert's confidence in making these fraudulent claims suggested that he genuinely believed his forged documents would be sufficient to justify stealing my property and belongings. Those documents are fake, I said, recognizing that my parents had apparently invested significant effort in creating fraudulent legal papers that they hoped would convince authorities or institutions that Marcus had legitimate claims to my inheritance. And you're committing multiple felonies by using forged documents to steal my property. But Linda had joined the conversation and was even more aggressive in her insistence that I had no rights to anything connected to the inheritance, treating me as if I were a criminal who had been illegitimately claiming ownership of assets that belonged to other family members. Everything here was bought with money that should have been distributed fairly among the family, Linda declared. And now that the legal situation has been corrected, you need to leave immediately. Drop that suitcase. You don't have any right to take anything that was purchased with estate funds. The demand that I drop the suitcase containing my personal belongings was particularly outrageous, as Linda was essentially claiming that every possession I owned was somehow connected to my inheritance and therefore subject to confiscation, now that she and Robert had decided Marcus was the rightful owner of William's estate. Have you ever had family members use forged documents to steal your property while physically preventing you from accessing your own belongings and treating you like a criminal for claiming ownership of things you legitimately owned? That's exactly what I experienced as my parents escalated from manipulation to outright theft and physical intimidation. When I refused to abandon my belongings and attempted to enter my own house to call police and document what was happening, Robert physically blocked my path and then grabbed my arm to prevent me from accessing my property, using force to remove me from premises that I legally owned while treating me as if I were trespassing on someone else's property. You need to leave now, Robert said, physically pushing me toward my car. This property belongs to Marcus, and you're not welcome here anymore. If you try to come back, we'll call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. The physical assault, combined with threats to have me arrested for trespassing on my own property, was both criminal behavior and evidence that my parents were prepared to use any means necessary to steal my inheritance, including violence and false accusations that could result in my arrest and prosecution on fabricated charges. But as Robert forced me to leave my own property, while movers continued loading my possessions into trucks hired by people who had no legal authority over my belongings, I realized that this confrontation was actually the culmination of the protection strategy I had implemented months earlier, when I first recognized my family's intentions to steal my inheritance. You're going to deeply regret this, I told Robert and Linda as I was forced to leave my own driveway, because you have no idea what you've actually done or what the consequences of your actions are going to be. The warning was both a promise and a statement of fact, because my parents' theft of what they believed was my inheritance was actually them taking legal responsibility for millions of dollars in hidden debts and financial obligations, while my real wealth remained completely protected in offshore jurisdictions they couldn't access or manipulate. But the immediate aftermath of being physically ejected from my own home and watching my belongings being confiscated by family members using forged documents was emotionally devastating, even though I knew that their apparent success in stealing my inheritance was actually the trigger for consequences they couldn't imagine, and legal problems that would ultimately destroy their financial security and freedom. The hotel room where I spent my first night after being physically removed from my own home felt both temporary and liberating, representing the end of my relationship with family members who had revealed themselves to be criminals, willing to use violence and fraud to steal my inheritance while treating me as if I had no rights or legal protections against their theft and manipulation. But while the personal betrayal was painful and the physical assault was traumatic, I felt a sense of anticipation about the legal and financial consequences that my parents were about to face as they discovered what they had actually stolen and the extent of their criminal liability for using forged documents to commit inheritance fraud while physically assaulting the legitimate owner of property they were attempting to steal. The phone calls to my attorneys and international wealth management specialists confirmed that my protection strategy had worked perfectly and that my parents' theft had only affected the decoy assets I had deliberately left vulnerable, while my real inheritance remained completely secure in offshore trusts and international legal structures that provided comprehensive protection against domestic fraud and legal manipulation. They can't access any of your real assets, international attorney David Martinez confirmed during our emergency consultation, and the properties and accounts they think they've stolen are actually shells containing substantial hidden debts that make them financial liabilities rather than benefits for anyone who claims ownership. But the most satisfying aspect of my parents' theft was that their forged documents had legal implications that would result in federal criminal charges for inheritance fraud, document forgery, and conspiracy, while their physical assault and forced removal of me from my own property constituted additional crimes that would likely result in substantial prison sentences even if they somehow avoided prosecution for the financial crimes. Your parents have committed multiple federal felonies, criminal attorney Sarah Johnson explained during our consultation about prosecution strategies. And the evidence you've provided includes documentation of the forged papers, witness accounts of the physical assault, and financial records showing the fraudulent transfer of assets. This is going to result in serious criminal charges and likely prison time for everyone involved. The criminal prosecution would be comprehensive and devastating for my parents and Marcus, but it would also provide legal vindication for my position as the legitimate inheritor of William's estate and official recognition that their actions had been criminal rather than legitimate corrections of supposed legal problems with the original inheritance distribution. Meanwhile, Marcus had moved into my former house and was beginning the process of liquidating what he believed were valuable assets to fund the luxury lifestyle he had always felt entitled to, but had never been able to afford through his own work and financial responsibility, completely unaware that he was actually liquidating worthless shell assets while accumulating massive debt obligations that would soon destroy his financial future. The social media posts that Marcus began sharing showed him celebrating his apparent good fortune and documenting his new luxury lifestyle, including expensive purchases, vacation travel, and lifestyle upgrades that he was funding through liquidation of properties and investments that he believed represented his newfound wealth and financial security. "Finally living the life I deserve," Marcus posted, along with photos of expensive clothes, luxury restaurants, and high-end purchases. "Grateful for the family legal action that corrected an unfair inheritance situation and gave me access to the wealth that should have been mine from the beginning." The celebration of his apparent inheritance while characterizing my legitimate ownership as unfair revealed Marcus's complete lack of understanding about what had actually happened and his willingness to participate in criminal fraud as long as he benefited financially from his parents' illegal actions. But Marcus's lifestyle spending was accelerating the discovery of the hidden debts and legal obligations that came with the shell assets he had inherited, as banks and creditors began demanding payment on mortgages, loans, and other financial instruments that had been deliberately attached to the decoy properties to create financial liability rather than benefit for anyone who stole them. "There seemed to be some problems with the properties Marcus inherited," Robert called to tell me several weeks after the theft, his voice filled with confusion and growing panic. "The banks are saying there are mortgages and debts that we didn't know about, and they're demanding immediate payment of amounts that exceed the property's apparent values." The discovery that their stolen inheritance included millions of dollars in hidden debts was the beginning of their understanding that they had been manipulated into taking financial responsibility for obligations they couldn't afford, rather than gaining access to the wealth they had expected to steal from my legitimate inheritance. Those debts are now Marcus's legal responsibility, I replied calmly, because he claimed ownership of properties through forged documents, and property ownership includes all associated financial obligations, whether the new owner was aware of them or not. But Robert was still trying to find ways to reverse the situation and escape the consequences of their criminal behavior, apparently believing that they could somehow undo their theft and return the stolen assets to avoid the financial obligations they had inherited, along with the properties they had fraudulently claimed. "We need to work together to resolve this situation," Robert pleaded. "The family made some mistakes, but we can fix this if everyone cooperates to find solutions that work for everyone involved." The characterization of criminal fraud and physical assault as mistakes that could be fixed through cooperation revealed that Robert still didn't understand the magnitude of their crimes or the permanence of the consequences they had created through their theft of what they believed was my inheritance. "There's nothing to resolve," I replied. "You committed multiple felonies to steal my inheritance, and now you're discovering that what you stole includes millions of dollars in debt obligations that Marcus is legally responsible for paying. You created this situation through criminal behavior, and you'll have to live with the consequences." Oh, the phone calls from Marcus were even more desperate and panicked as he began to understand that his apparent inheritance was actually a financial catastrophe that would likely result in bankruptcy and potential criminal prosecution for participating in inheritance fraud through his acceptance of stolen assets. "Amanda, you have to help me," Marcus begged during one of his calls. "I didn't understand what Mom and Dad were doing, and now I'm facing millions of dollars in debt that I can't pay. This is going to destroy my life, and I need you to fix whatever legal problems they created." The plea for help from someone who had participated in stealing my inheritance while celebrating his supposed good fortune was both pathetic and revealing about his expectation that I should solve problems he had created through his own criminal behavior and greed. "You participated in using forged documents to steal my property," I replied. "And you physically moved into my house while I was homeless because of your family's criminal actions. You're facing the consequences of your own choices, and I have no obligation to help you escape the legal and financial problems you created." But the most satisfying development was learning that the federal investigation into my parents' crimes was proceeding rapidly, and that criminal charges would be filed within weeks, ensuring that their theft of my inheritance would result in appropriate legal consequences, including prison sentences and complete financial restitution for their fraud and assault. The true scope of my parents' legal problems became clear when federal agents arrested Robert, Linda, and Marcus on charges of inheritance fraud, document forgery, conspiracy, assault, and money laundering, while simultaneously seizing all the assets they had stolen and freezing their personal finances to prevent them from hiding or transferring funds that would be needed for restitution payments to compensate for their crimes. "Your family members are facing federal charges that carry potential sentences of 15 to 20 years in federal prison," Prosecutor James Wilson explained during our meeting about their criminal case. "And the evidence is so comprehensive that we expect guilty pleas rather than trials that would result in even longer sentences." The criminal prosecution was swift and decisive, with all three family members pleading guilty to avoid longer sentences that would have resulted from jury trials where the evidence of their crimes was overwhelming and undeniable. Robert and Linda each received 8-year federal prison sentences, while Marcus received 6 years due to his lesser role in planning the fraud, though his financial liability for the hidden debts would continue long after his release from prison. But beyond the criminal consequences, the most important outcome was the complete recovery and protection of my inheritance, which had never actually been at risk due to the offshore restructuring I had implemented before my family's theft attempts, though the domestic legal proceedings provided official vindication of my legitimate ownership and legal authority over William's estate. The new life I built with my protected inheritance was everything my grandfather had envisioned when he chose me as his sole heir, featuring strategic investments that continued growing his legacy, philanthropic activities that honored his memory, and the kind of responsible wealth management that ensured his fortune would benefit future generations rather than being squandered by family members who viewed inheritance as entitlement rather than responsibility. Your grandfather would be incredibly proud of how you protected his legacy, estate attorney Michael Harrison told me during our final meeting about the legal resolution. Your strategic thinking and protective measures saved his entire fortune from family members who would have destroyed it through poor decisions and criminal behavior. The offshore wealth management structure I had created provided both security and flexibility for long-term financial planning, international investment opportunities, and protection from future family attempts to access or manipulate my inheritance through legal challenges or fraudulent schemes. But the most valuable outcome wasn't financial. It was the clarity about family relationships and the understanding that protecting yourself from people who view your success as their entitlement sometimes requires decisive action that permanently ends relationships with relatives who prioritize greed over family loyalty and respect. If you're reading this and you're facing family pressure about inheritance or dealing with relatives who feel entitled to wealth that doesn't belong to them, please know that comprehensive legal protection is available and that anticipating family greed can prevent them from succeeding in their theft attempts. Sometimes the people who claim to love you most are actually the ones most likely to betray you when significant money is involved. And protecting your assets from family manipulation isn't selfish. It's necessary for preserving wealth that was entrusted to your stewardship. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share your experiences in the comments below. Have you ever had to protect your inheritance from family members who felt entitled to your wealth? How did you handle relatives who used manipulation or threats to try accessing money that didn't belong to them? Your story might help someone else facing similar family dynamics and inheritance protection challenges. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and remember that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is protect family wealth from family members who would destroy it through their greed and sense of entitlement. See you in our next story here on Her Sweet Revenge.